You're listening to the Greenhouse and Indoor Cultivation Podcast, presented by GroAdvisor. Tune in to learn strategies to grow your business, get the most out of your cultivation systems, and advance your horticulture career.
Hello, growers and business owners. It's Brandon and Will, your favorite podcast host for the controlled environment agriculture industry. I just wanted to tell you, if you haven't heard yet, that we'll also be launching guides, blogs, and videos at GroAdvisorWorldwide.com. I'm really excited about it because we're going to be giving people practical, tactical guidance, instruction, all filled with expert advice, not just from us here at GroAdvisor, but from other greenhouse and indoor farming experts. Each episode will show a new expert from traditional horticulture, cannabis, vertical farming, vegetable farming, system design. It's going to be amazing. So if you want to learn how to scale your horticulture business and career from start to cultivation success, you're going to want to tune in. Go to our website, like us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and we already have a wait list, so join our newsletter so you can be the first to know when we release new guidance and strategies to realize your true growth potential. All right, I'm going back to doing podcasts and stuff. I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks. Hello, growers. Thanks for joining us today for the Greenhouse and Indoor Cultivation Podcast. Today, we have Jim Pantaleo, indoor vertical farm operator and advisor, speaking with us about best practices for vertical farming systems. So, Jim, thanks for joining us here today. You have quite the extensive resume. Why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Thanks, Brandon. I'm Jim Pantaleo, and for the last six years, I've been involved in indoor vertical farming, primarily indoor vertical farming, so growing food indoors using only LED lights as photosynthesis. I've had a number of different roles in the industry over the last 6 years, everything from, writer, speaker, to farm operator, to conference chairman of Indoor AgCon, which is sort of the de facto gathering place for indoor vertical farming. Prior to that, I spent 20 years in software licensing, half of that with Hewlett-Packard. So I was a technology guy, and it's been a journey, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you today and sharing that journey with you, and hopefully inspiring and helping other people that are listening to either make a change from what they're doing now to absolutely getting involved in indoor vertical farming in terms of, a career move. So it's important, and I'm happy to be with you guys today. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. So let's just get right into it here. You're so passionate about the indoor farming industry, and you came from technology for 20 years. You say you want to create positive change in the world. You see vertical farming as that future. What do you envision for the future of vertical farming, and why is this such an influential program and industry right now?
So as I've always said, when I started in this industry, the data scared me. And when I say scared, I mean at a visceral level when you think about the data. And so the data is, and when we talk about indoor vertical farming, everybody sort of sings from this same hymnal, is that there are 7 billion people on the planet today. By 2050, in another 30 years, there'll be another 3 billion. So we'll top out at about 10 billion. And then here's the scary part, in that 70% of all arable farmland on the planet today is gone, unavailable, either built over or simply not there. 70+% of all available potable water goes toward potable, maybe that's not the right word, but water goes towards agriculture. In 2050, upwards of 80% of human populations will live in urban areas. And then you pile in all the stuff that we've just talked about with a supply chain, food miles, overusage of pesticides, again, lack of water resources, all of those scary kind of areas of our future that sort of drove me into understanding how I could help. And how I could help is knowing that indoor vertical farming would never be an answer to current modern agriculture or large scale corporate farming, if you will. But we could get to a point where we would be able to supplement modern large scale farming. And when you look at what's happening over the last 6 months with COVID, and you think about supply chain constraints, and you think about food security and insecurity, it just all makes sense. But we're at the very beginning of it. I know that, and we've got a long time to go until it's proven, make it real in terms of, again, that supplement to large scale agriculture. But I got into this, you guys, by fear, essentially. I was afraid. I was afraid for myself, and I was afraid for my children.
You know, especially during COVID-19 and the era that we're living, it really does create the climate where vertical farming is a great solution for saving some of the supply chain, bringing produce closer to the neighborhoods through which they're served. When a lot of people think vertical farming, they think there's so much infrastructure that goes into it. How could that make sense over outdoor farming? But they don't realize all the infrastructure that goes into delivering the produce. It's massive as well.
Right. I think there's really no doubt in my mind that vertical farming is really critical to the future. And Jim, I'm curious, when I think of vertical farming and working with our clients, typically, things always come back to cost, considerations about all the costs associated with it. You've got your costs of, your farming systems, your electricity, other resources. And Jim, how do you think about the costs associated with vertical farming, especially when compared to that of, greenhouses or outdoor agriculture?
Yeah, so you're spot on in that cost is a primary challenge today for indoor vertical farming. There is an equation that is used by many academics, and that is, what is your yield based on your per kilowatt hour charge? And if that per kilowatt hour charge is a nickel or less, you're stoked, you're happy. But right now, that equation of what is your yield, how much product can you get based on your per kilowatt hour usage, is really critical. Everything else that I would tell you right now is all secondary to that. And the everything else is, you got it, lights, labor, energy, water, building costs, consumables, etc., etc., etc. So all of that ties into the critical equation of how much can you grow based on the kilowatt hours that you have to pay for. And then again, ultimately, and what I just said, actually, you could wrap that up into a little bow of a COGS analysis. So your cost of goods sold analysis, which is how much money is going into to create this plant and to sell this plant. And again, everything from, again, labor, energy, lighting, et cetera, building costs, insurance. So it's, you're right. It can be solved. Some people are doing it well now. Some people aren't. You are looking at a failure. I'm a failure. I'm a two-time failure through no fault of my own, I like to say, but I have been part of two farms that are no longer. And when you experience failure, you learn a lot.
Absolutely. Are there certain, just a quick follow-up, Jim, are there certain areas of the country or certain areas of the world where your per kilowatt hour makes more sense? And just really quickly, are there companies that come to mind that are doing it especially well?
Yeah, so, I haven't really studied that, William. That's a great question, but clearly where you have low energy prices is where you want to set up shop. And then, of course, the other thing is that when we're talking about indoor farming, if we're not talking about containers, we're talking about buildings or structures. Again, where there's no ambient light coming in, no natural sunlight. All of your photosynthesis happens through LED lighting. But I can say that the first farm that I was a part of, one of the critical errors is that the building, although a great building, was leased, and it was in a very, I'd say, a high income area of Southern California. And so when you look at perhaps some of the big farms today and where they are, I mean, you look at the big three, Bowery, Plenty, and Aero Farms. You know, Bowery and Aero Farms are in New Jersey and Newark, which is traditionally an area that has been challenged, you know, on a number of levels. South San Francisco, where where Plenty is not the lowest rent income district, if you will, but it is an industrial city. In fact, if you fly into San Francisco Airport, you'll see on the side of the mountain, it says South San Francisco, the industrial city. It's in huge letters on the side of the mountain. Brandon, you know this, being a Northern Californian guy. But, you know, having said that, I think that there's a lot more to this in terms of where folks set up shop, which is a whole nother discussion when we talk about some of the larger retailers in our country, the guys that are down in Bentonville, Arkansas, for example, or when we talk about Plenty, we talk about the fact that they are in part of the Whole Foods family. And just across the bay in Emeryville, there is a Whole Foods distribution center. And so how much sense would it make to grow your food so close to that disty center and then ship it right over, and away you go in terms of distribution to West Region Whole Food stores, for example. And it's not a lot of SKUs, it's not a lot of crops, it may be 3 or 4, you know, some basil perhaps, some chives, maybe some spinach, whatever they're growing there at Plenty. And so those kinds of things make sense in terms of buildings. But to your point, William, you absolutely 100% need to be in areas where it's beneficial for you, where there are tax benefits and low rent and all the other things that come into play.
Absolutely.
Well, I hate to hear you say that you think you're a failure, Jim, because you've done so much. But I am interested in walking through those facilities. What's it like? You know, I mean, you've seen probably the good and the worst. You know, what is it like in these facilities and day-to-day operations? And tell us a little, give us a picture of some of what that looks like.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. My first farm was in a 30,000 square foot building, and in the form factor that we grew in was a small portion of that, so maybe about 6,000 square feet, and it was floor to ceiling, about 20 feet up. And I have some videos on my LinkedIn profile if anybody cares to see that. But the urban produce system was fascinating in that it was a system that was like a dry cleaners. So when you go to the dry cleaners, your shirts and your pants are like hanging, and they're on a track, and that person plugs in where your clothes are and it swings around. This particular system was like that, and it was really cool. It was huge. We were able to load literally thousands of plants onto it. We harvested more than a ton of product a week. It was fantastic. I'm so sorry and sad that it's not still in existence, and there are a number of reasons why. But when you're talking about growing in large scale commercially, you know, it's not for the faint of heart, and you have to be ready to deal with the biology of it all, including, again, you know, tonnage of product. And so that was my first foray. The second farm was even bigger, and that was an experimental farm out in Las Vegas called Oasis Biotech. Oasis Biotech was in a 215,000 square foot facility about 5 miles from the McCarran Airport, and very close to a number of really key Las Vegas produce distributors, which was the plan of action for that. There were some challenges with the building. There were some other challenges, and I'm also sorry that operation is not still operating. But again, we learned so much from failure, you guys, and I could speak at length about why they focused on Las Vegas. Certainly, I would love to see farms come back to Las Vegas. Clearly, when we talk about COVID, we know that restaurants are super strained. I can tell you that one of the primary reasons why Oasis Biotech set up in Las Vegas was that you have 43 million unique mouths and visitors every year. At least you did. So the modus operandi was to engage with key produce distributors in the valley, in the Las Vegas Valley, who fed those 43 million eaters and visitors, who would stay at places like the Bellagio or the MGM or the Venetian. And so still a very, very smart thing to do, and I'm certainly hoping somebody will continue to focus on that. But again, you guys, if you've read the story of, and I'm not comparing myself to this guy at all, but Abraham Lincoln failed at like everything he ever did, starting with getting his bar exam. He failed the bar exam, tried to be a senator, failed being a senator, tried being president, vice president, failed at that, and kept coming back and kept coming back. So that's really kind of the lesson I think I take from these failures, is that you learn a lot.
Certainly you do. Yeah. Well, I love to see a picture of some of the insides of these facilities,
I have some. I'm happy to share.
Yeah, we'll drop a link on the transcript of this for viewers to take a look.
Sounds good.
But you hit on a lot of the major benefits, year-round production, unaffected by weather, space utilization, the list goes on and on. So for those looking to start a vertical farm or foray into this exciting and very entrepreneurial business, what are some of the factors that they should look out for? Maybe some of the failure points that you've come to realize.
Yeah, great. So great question. So when starting a farm, I always like to say you absolutely have to prove the building, and then you prove the crop. And that could take a little while. And when I say prove the building, you must make sure that all your environmental controls are in line with the actual crop and the plant, that if you have any failures, if you will, of energy, or if there's any issues with water, with your dosing systems, again, with environmental controls in terms of heat, humidity, etc., airflow, all those areas are really super important in terms of proving the building first. And, investors don't really like to hear that it could take 6 months to a year to prove a building, but it's actually true. We're talking about biology here. It's not like you can just whip it out and suddenly have, a solid crop that is grown in volume consistently with amazing flavor and quality. That's just not going to happen. So when talking about starting a farm, my advice and recommendation is always start small. I've been a part of some multi-million-dollar operations. I don't really want to talk to your audience, gentlemen, about that as much as I want to say, good God, if you could find 5,000 square feet and you've got a good water source and you can handle the electricity, and you know that you're close to potential customers, whether, again, those were things like I spoke about earlier about produce distributors, those folks that distribute to hospitals, restaurants, hotels, etc. And again, knowing the restaurant portion of this equation is struggling right now. But on the other side of that are things like retail. Who are your big retailers nearby, as well as one of the biggest revenue sources that folks in indoor vertical farming today, I don't think focus on at all. And that is product-based growing. And when I say product-based growing, I want you to think about if you've had a Naked Juice green machine product. It's a PepsiCo product. The green machine is actually it's a powderized product of inputs, but PepsiCo own Naked Juice. Naked Juice procure raw inputs from indoor farmers, and I would put myself in that category. And those inputs go into end products that are bottled. And so I think that when you talk about revenue sources, folks need to think about not only growing for a shelf in a grocery store or a plate through a distributor or restaurant, what have you, but also for a product in a bottle. And we know that when you talk about folks like Odwalla, V8, Coca-Cola, Bolthouse Farms, again, PepsiCo and many of their brands, these folks are clamoring for clean, consistent, excellent product and excellent product inputs in volume. And when we talk about product inputs, I can share with you that the product that we sold was wheatgrass. So wheatgrass is a totally unsexy product, but it grows really quickly, and it is part of an input of many of the drinks. There are other ubiquitous inputs that can be grown in indoor farms for product-based growings, and they include things like parsley, alfalfa, kale, and spinach, along with wheatgrass. And so I challenge anybody listening to just go to a store and grab a green drink and look at the ingredients, and you'll see wheatgrass, parsley, alfalfa, kale, spinach. They'll be on that list, and you can grow that all day long, starting as a small operation, building those relationships with product companies, or again, retail, or again, food distributors. And that's the way to do it. But there's a lot more to this, you guys. There's a lot more to it.
Well, you say that wheatgrass isn't sexy, but I remember back to Jabba Juice, and I think Jabba Juice really made their company quite large from the wheatgrass shot, and it really became popularized at that time.
Well, Jabba Juice was also a customer of ours,
Yeah.
and they were a great customer. They have been sold to another company. Jabba Juice has fantastic distribution centers, and they've got a really solid group of franchisees. So Jabba Juice is a franchise. And so here in the Western region, all the way up to the Alaskan border, down to the Mexican border, you have Jabba Juice franchisees that if you walked into a Jabba Juice, well, they're kind of closed now, aren't they? Because a lot of them are in malls. But our wheatgrass would be there. They would cut you off a 3-ounce portion. They'd cold press it in front of you and give you a little slice of lemon, and away you go. They were a fantastic customer. So I want indoor farmers and those that really want to get into this industry to think about that product-based growing, those kinds of entities.
Most growers in most industries should think on a product basis. You see in a controlled environment, it's obvious. You can control everything from the light spectrum to every other input variable. And you can end up with more highly nutrient crops. You can target specific nutrients potentially by adjusting spectrum of your lights. And that can create value in your end product. On the cannabis side of things, if you're making CBD versus THC products, that should be thought about, everything from strain selection down to the extraction methods and so forth. So I think in many industries, they should be thinking product-based. You mentioned the restaurant industry as well. I've seen restaurants. I think there was it was a Michelin chef at a restaurant up in California in the Sonoma region, was working with a local grower who had a greenhouse using adjustable spectrum lighting to increase or to change the flavor profiles of various herbs, culinary herbs and other crops, to have a unique differentiation in their dishes, and I think that's brilliant. And I think really everyone from the small to the large guys should be thinking that way. But I'm happy that you brought that up.
You know as well as I do, of being a former lighting guy, that the notion of tweaking a spectrum in order to tweak a plant or a flavor is critical. I would take it a step further, however, Brandon, and I would go into seed and down to the germplasm, if you will, if you want to be a plant nerd with me for a moment, in that where we need to be in indoor vertical farming, just like they are, with field farming, in that, there's seed created today and for many, many years that is somewhat, for whatever, choose a pest resistant or a drought resistant seed, or, what have you. I mean, that, one of my favorite stories is when we talk about seed and plant and how we can go from like one part of our humanity and where we are in the time spectrum of agriculture, go back 60 or 70 years to Dr. Norman Borlaug, who, as you might know, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his work in the 1930s and 40s and 50s in China and India, creating a dwarf wheat plant, because at the time, the only wheat that could be grown in those areas was a taller wheat that would blow over in the wind. So Borlaug comes along and creates this dwarf wheat plant and literally saves the lives of millions of people, hence the Nobel Peace Prize.
What are some of the best practices you see that you would recommend for these growers?
Yeah, so when if we're talking about what I'm doing with Indoor AgCon and how we're trying to bring people together there, we're really talking about a whole gamut of disciplines, everything from AI to robotics to, sensors, computer learning, all of the super, super cutting edge areas of farming, which of course you'll see, pardon the pun, growing a lot in greenhouse farming. And again, when we think about field farming and what's going on in field farming with AI and how does that transfer to indoor vertical farming, simple things. Again, I mentioned sensors, how dry is it in this particular part of the farm in terms of the soil? Do you need to amend that? What are issues with, the plant in general? But as we look at indoor vertical farming, all those areas of technology are huge. And we touched on lighting. We well know some of the strong lighting companies, horticultural lighting companies on the planet today are doing some really amazing work. But I just feel like it's, and then again, to pivot, if you don't mind, you mentioned the work with Indoor AgCon. So I'm the content chairman of Indoor AgCon. I'm the speaker wrangler. Indoor AgCon was purchased a year and a half ago by 3 really great people that are looking to kind of spread and increase awareness and really build Indoor AgCon to sort of the premier gathering place amongst this industry. Sadly, COVID put a kibosh on our event in Las Vegas this May. They have pivoted to have online events called Indoor Ag Conversations, which is cool. And we've been bringing in a lot of industry folk to talk about everything from food safety to folks like Aero Farms and their journey, to, again, next week, having a bunch of guys that have worked in space crop production from NASA and elsewhere. So part of that vibration for me is to really keep the focus for the wider world on those areas, again, if it's technology or people. But also the other thing that I'm really wanting to focus on also is kind of laying this out there from a humanistic perspective. You know, we're three dudes right now talking, but there are a lot of really amazing women in indoor farming right now. In fact, I put together a panel a couple weeks ago called Women in Ag, and had some just amazing women. So there's a lot of areas that I really want to help push forward, and I'm super lucky to be able to do that. And it's been a really fun journey, and so many voices out there, so many voices, and just want to give those guys a platform.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, you know, you really touched on a lot of points there. You know, I think when it comes to systems integration, we're no strangers to that. You know, we offer the lighting, the racks, benches, fertigation control systems, working with Argus, integrating Argus and some other lesser known control systems like microclimates and Century IQ over at Cerna. You know, everyone has their place. There's certainly a lot of exciting new technology out there. So from a technology perspective, supply chain, humanistic, anything that you spoke about, it's all interesting. You know, where do you see this industry going in the next 10 years? You know, is this a century away? Is it 10 years away to a real scalable level? And
no,
yeah,
we're 10 years, Brandon, for sure, or less, much less. And I really want to point out something that was in the news today. Is a really interesting gentleman that you may know. His name is Victor Verlage. Victor Verlage, for the past 7 or 8 years, has been Walmart's main driver of engaging with indoor vertical farms in the United States. Why? Because Walmart has something like 47 distribution centers around our country, and they would like nothing more, kind of like the Plenty Whole Foods scenario we talked about earlier, than to cut their supply chain and have a certain amount of those SKUs or product come from a farm extremely close to them. And so Victor Verlage, actually, this week, it was announced that he's leaving Walmart and he's going to work for 80 Acres Farms, the Cincinnati outfit run by Mike Zelkind and others. And so when you think about supply chain, when you think about the biggest, strongest retailers in our country, and what's happening in terms of movement, engagement, collaboration. You know, there's an indoor farm in Cleburne, Texas, called Eden Green. Eden Green is literally across the street from a Walmart distribution center. So when you think about the next 5 or 10 years, and you think about really, really how these farms can get down and get going with the supply chain, these are the kind of things that you have to think about. Whether it's Plenty and Whole Foods, or whether it's Walmart and then Victor leaving Walmart and going to work for an indoor farm, 80 acres, it's all part of it. So I really feel that in the next 5+ years, you'll see these kinds of movements. Certainly you'll have well-funded farms like the big three, but you'll also have smaller farms that'll do great things also. Some of them I've mentioned today. And I just really feel that, again, as I've always said, and anybody will tell you this, is that indoor vertical farming will never be the answer to all ag. It will only be a supplement. And as we see what's happening again with COVID in terms of supply chain, it can be a really fantastic supplement, especially when we talk about food safety and supply chain.
I agree. Couldn't agree more. Well, Jim, I have to say, I really appreciate your insight. There's been a lot of good information on this call. I'm going to be dropping some links here for those that scroll down on the page or go to GroAdvisorWorldwide.com and check out this podcast. We'll have some links of photos and resources for everybody. And I really appreciate you coming on, my friend. This has been great, and we'll talk more soon.
Thanks, Brandon. I really appreciate it, William. My pleasure. You guys are doing great work. Thank you very much for having me.
Likewise,
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks for being here.
You bet. Bye-bye.